We're going to get started. I mean, I assume some people may have seen on the news that there has been a crazy fire in town. So hopefully no one's been affected and hopefully people can still attend, but we aren't expecting everyone to be able to show up if Sydney chaos turns into chaos like it always does. For those who don't know me, my name is Candice Richards. I'm the Assistant Curator for the Nicholson Collection here at the Chau Museum. And as we begin today, I'd like to acknowledge the fact that we're gathering on Gadigal land, unceded land of the Eora Nation. And as we gather today, I think it's really important that we think about the way in which this land has been part of storytelling, knowledge exchange, and teaching and learning for tens of thousands of years. And so as we gather today, we're continuing on in that tradition that's always been a part of this country. And we pay our respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging, and all those who care for and continue to care for this space. So today I'm very excited for this evening's talk. But before we get onto that and introduce Hugh, who will be actually taking over the official proceedings for the evening, I just want to remind everybody that we have a couple of really great fun events coming up at the Chak Museum. On the very first weekend of every month, we have special curated tours for each of the exhibitions that we have on display. And the next one on the 1st of June is Katrina Libiero, who's the Assistant Curator for the Art Collection, who's going to take us through photography and performance. And so that's a free tour. And we have lots of stuff on our website. So make sure you do come along to our events. Next month, we're going to have Damien Stone, who's an archaeologist, as well as one of the collections officers here, launching his new book on the Hittites, which is one not to miss. So I hope you can all join us for that free event as well. So I'd like to hand over now to Dr. Hugh Thomas from the Department of Archaeology here at the University of Sydney to officially kick us off tonight.
Thanks, Candice. As Candice just said, my name's Hugh Thomas. I'm a relatively new lecturer here at the University of Sydney. But before we get to sort of the main event tonight, as part of National Archaeology Week, I just wanted to take the opportunity to tell you about all the wonderful archaeological work that the university is doing at the moment. Because just like many aspects of our life, COVID-19 decimated archaeological work both here in Australia and overseas. Yet the discipline is doing a spectacular rebound at the moment with a significant number of projects taking place all over the place. And I just want to show you some of those today. The Paphos Archaeological Theatre project has just returned after a successful excavation season around the Hellenistic and Roman site on Cyprus. And the team was primarily made up of University of Sydney students, many of whom were experiencing fieldwork for the very first time. Also right now, my very own project, of which I'm a co-director, the Prehistoric Alula and Kaibar Excavation Project, is currently in the middle, right as we speak at this moment in Alula, Saudi Arabia, excavating that very structure on the screen, a 7,000-year-old ritual structure known as a mustatil. And you're more than welcome to follow us on Twitter if you like. We also have Dr. Joseph Seppi-Lerner, who many of you know, who is the co-director of the Kirkenes project, which is slated to kick off in about a month's time. And we have a number of both University of Sydney staff and I think some students as well heading along onto that wonderful project. And I think there's over 50 or 60 people who are going to take part in that fieldwork, which is really, really special to see that coming back. Alison Betts, who's the new head of the discipline, is currently doing her diet, cuisine, and food resilience along the Himalayan rim. This project is a collaboration with a place called Naga, Australia, a UK team, and they're doing some really fantastic work in order to look at things like food production. More closer to home, we have James Flexner, who's working around sort of the French Polynesia region. He also has a field school taking place in Blacktown in Appin Road as a collaboration with GML, a local contract archaeological company here in Sydney, and Dr. Amy Mosigwe, along with Wayne Brennan, who is one of our 2 First Nation mentors whose jobs it is to help our First Nation students traverse through doing archaeology at the University of Sydney. She's recently completed excavations up at a cave site in the Blue Mountains and will be doing more in the not too distant future and has some really fantastic results, which I unfortunately can't tell you about. Closer to home, the Archaeology Seminar Series run by the discipline here at the Chau Museum is going from strength to strength. It's every fortnight or so, and it will start again in semester 2. If you aren't part of the mailing list for that, please just point your phone right at that QR code. But it's really designed to not only showcase the amazing archaeological work that's being done both here and overseas, but also we're designing it so that afterwards we'll go down into the cafe and that students, staff, our visiting lecturers can all mingle together and interact after so many years of not being able to do that. And also Dr. Leslie Beaumont and Dr. Associate Professor Leslie Beaumont, I should say, and Dr. Stavros Paspoulos are running a second iteration of the intensive archaeology program in Athens over this summer. And that's because normally it's hosted once every 2 years. They had so many people apply for it, they've had to run it twice this year alone to fill the needs for that. I think they have over 60 students going, which is really wonderful that they get to learn about the archaeological material in Athens, which I think is absolutely fantastic. And finally, the Veer Gordon Child Center, which will eventually move into the Kanisa area, is slowly becoming more and more of a reality. It's going to be a sort of a hub of both domestic and international archaeologists coming together to perform research. And it's something that I encourage you to keep an eye out for, because once it does start moving forward and open eventually, it's going to be truly spectacular. But as you can see, archaeology here is thriving now that COVID restrictions have relaxed, and we are very thankful that the world has returned to some semblance of normal because it's allowed our speaker to finally make her way out to Australia. Dr. Debby Sneed is the Assistant Professor of Classics at California State University Long Beach. They're called, apparently Go Beach, as they say. She completed her bachelor's in Wyoming, an MA at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and a PhD at UCLA, which she finished in 2018. She's worked in sites in Greece, Italy, Ethiopia, and the US. She's actually about to come to Saudi Arabia with me tomorrow night at about this time for a week. And also, I'm very happy to announce that, if Debbie hasn't announced this properly already, she's recently been appointed the field director for the Agra excavations in Athens, which is going to be run by Professor John Papadopoulos, who is a Sydney University old boy and an Australian, which is amazing. So congratulations on that, Debbie. So Debbie has published widely on disability in ancient Greece, and probably her most famous is the 2020 paper on ramps in Greek sanctuaries. It received worldwide media attention. You would have seen all over Twitter. It was on Nature magazine, Live Science, and a bunch of other things. She also is the very famous Debscavator on Twitter, which I think is my all-time favorite archaeological pun Twitter handle, which now boasts an amazing size, ever-growing audience. So please follow her on there for some witty banter. But luckily for us, tonight, Debbie is here as part of the Kanisa Apollo Fellowship. And she's been out here for the last several weeks conducting research and meeting academics and students alike. Now, personally, I'm very fortunate that, to have worked with Debbie at the site of ancient Methone in northern Greece for over 4 years. And I'm very thankful that of those 4 years excavating side by side and our growing friendship, it's allowed me to say that I will know Debby Sneed before she is famous, because it's clear that from Debbie's academic focus and how she communicates her research with all the sort of how we revolutionize how we look at disability in the ancient world, it's going to change how we view archaeology. And I honestly and sincerely believe that. And it's really changed both my opinion on it, both in terms of disability in antiquity and even how we approach disability today. So she's changed my opinions and my knowledge about the topic, and I think she's going to do the same for you tonight. So please welcome Dr. Debby Sneed to present her lecture, Golden Maidens and Wheelchairs, Assistive Technology in Ancient Greece.
Thank you so much to Dr. Thomas for that very generous and only slightly embarrassing introduction. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm so grateful to the Center for Classical and Near Eastern Studies of Australia, as well as to the students and staff at the University of Sydney and the broader community for welcoming me and sharing your time and conversation with me. I want to thank Dr. Leslie Beaumont for her years of support at this point, as well as Dr. Hugh Thomas and Dr. Mel Kennedy for their generosity in hosting me in their home for the past 3 weeks. Thank you too to Craig Barker for making tonight's talk possible. So some of you are already familiar with my work, but in broad strokes, I study physical disability in ancient Greece. In particular, I look at the lives of physically disabled ancient Greeks, where and how they participated in their societies, the interactions that they had with and within their families and communities, and how they navigated their lives. In my research, I have looked at the myth that ancient Greeks, and especially the ancient Spartans, killed disabled infants. I argue that we have a lot of evidence that shows the opposite. Ancient parents, midwives, and physicians taking extraordinary efforts to help disabled infants survive. I've looked at architectural features in the form of ramps, which you'll hear a little bit about today, to argue that ancient Greeks intentionally designed certain spaces to be accessible to some disabled people. My work also takes me outside of ancient Greece and into the modern period. I co-authored an article with Mason Schrader, a PhD student at the Joukowsky Institute for Archaeology at Brown University, about making archaeological projects accessible to disabled students. And another with Alison Blank, a PhD student at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU, on why it matters that we discuss disability in our classrooms and our research. All of this work is informed by the work done by scholars in disability studies and related disciplines. There are 2 points that I think are really important to remember when you start thinking about disability in the ancient Greek world. First, when we think about disability as a form of bodily or mental difference, then disability is a universal feature of human experience. As People with Disability Australia has so aptly put it, disability is part of being human. Almost everyone will temporarily or permanently experience disability at some point in their life. In Australia today, nearly 20% of people are reported as having a disability, and everyone has the potential to become disabled or even multiply disabled at any time, something that has hit home for many of us during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. And disability is one of those rare categories of identity that cross-cuts all others. You can be or become disabled no matter your age, gender or sex, sexuality, class, wealth, or citizenship status. Similar things are true in the ancient world. There are a few things that we can say are absolutely true about the ancient Greek world, but one of those things is that disabled people existed at all levels of and in every role in society, from poor enslaved people to esteemed kings and generals. The second point that is important to remember is that while disability is in a sense universal, it cannot be universalized because how someone experiences a disabled life depends on myriad factors related to those various aspects of their identity, what skills and employment they have, and whether they have access to resources or care. One's experience of disability also depends on things like when and where they live. Consider the statistic that about half of the population of Australia wears glasses or contact lenses, according to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. Poor eyesight or some kind of eye health condition is easily solved in the modern period. Wearing eyeglasses is not really stigmatized. And with few exceptions, needing or wearing eyeglasses won't affect your ability to get and keep a wide range of jobs. In the ancient world, however, there were no corrective lenses. So poor eyesight would have potentially been much more consequential if, for example, you were trained as a vase painter or worked in the mines. In opposite fashion, dyslexia may have been less relevant for the daily lives of most ancient Greeks who were not necessarily expected to be literate. What disabilities matter and how they're experienced by people, these are not universal truths. And our task is not to make assumptions about disability in the ancient world based on our modern understandings of disability in our sort of modern capitalist industrial societies with our very different lives and our different social values and priorities. So disability is universal, but it's also very particular, and it cannot be understood universally. And I bring up these 2 points because they inform my talk tonight. In the rest of my time, I'm going to talk about assistive technology, a term that refers to equipment or devices that help you do things that you cannot do because of some form of bodily or mental difference. Assistive devices extend the bodies of disabled people in ways that enable them to participate in society in ways that are similar to their non-disabled peers, thereby potentially, but not necessarily, bridging the gap between them. I'm going to start my talk, as so many in my discipline do, in the world of myth. In Homer's Iliad, the Greek hero Achilles abstains from the battlefield until his beloved Patroclus is killed by the Trojan prince Hector. Should have given you a spoiler alert. Achilles wants revenge against Hector, but he is stymied. Patroclus had been wearing his armor when he was killed, so Achilles needs new armor before he can return to the fray and kill Hector. His mother, the goddess Thetis, is going to secure him some new armor that befits his status. So she visits the home of the divine craftsman Hephaestus to commission him to make her son some new armor. We're told that silver-footed Thetis came to the house of Hephaestus, imperishable, starry, distinguished among the immortals, a bronze house which the crook-footed god made himself. She found him sweating as he moved around the bellows hastily, for he was making tripods, 20 in all, to stand against the wall of his well-built halls. And beneath the base of each, he installed golden wheels, so that they of their own motion could enter a divine gathering and then return home, a wonder to behold. Now, Hephaestus and Thetis, they have a history. Okay, Hephaestus was congenitally disabled and he had a mobility impairment. And at his birth, his mother Hera rejected him and threw him out of Olympus. Thetis had accepted him and raised him. So Hephaestus is eager to return her kindness here. When she arrives at his house, he closes down his workshop. He puts his tools away so that he can turn his full attention to her. And the mighty giant rose from his bellows, limping. But beneath him, his slender legs moved quickly. He set the bellows far from the fire, and he gathered all the tools he worked with into a silver box. Then with a sponge, he wiped about his face, both hands, his sturdy neck and hairy chest, and he donned a tunic, then took up a thick staff and went out the door, limping. And at their master's command, attendants moved, made of gold and resembling live maidens. There is intelligence in their minds, and in them speech and strength. And from the immortal gods, they know how to do things. They huffed and puffed under their master, and he moving slowly near to where Hephaestus sat. Now, these two passages are very close to each other in the poem. And think about how in both of them, the poet uses really descriptive language to help you visualize the scene. Hephaestus is huge. He's a mighty giant, but the legs beneath him are slender. He uses a sponge to wipe his face and his hands, as well as his sturdy neck and his hairy chest. His box is silver, his staff is thick, his attendants are golden. This follows closely after that first passage I read, where Hephaestus is described as sweating as he works. He's called crook-footed, and the original ancient Greek vocabulary implies a kind of curving shape to the god's feet, a curving that is picked up in the next line with that verb moving around. This is a kind of bland translation of the ancient Greek verb here. The verb is often used to describe snakes coiling and waves crashing and time circling. So with both crook-footed and moved around, we should imagine a roundness to his feet and to his movement. This roundedness is often picked up in vase painting, as in this 6th century BCE Hydria. You can see the ways that Hephaestus's feet are shown with a kind of curving here. In these two passages from the Iliad, we get a rich sense of Hephaestus's appearance, but also a vivid sense of how he moves. In that second passage, we see that he rose from the bellows. His limping is mentioned not once, but twice. His movement is both vertical and horizontal, and it is his movement that renders his body visible. In turn, it is his hulking, sweating body with his slender legs and curved feet that draws our attention to his movement. His body and his movement therefore reinforce each other as the poet encourages us to visualize him and the way he moves. If we go back to that first passage, we see that when Thetis arrives, Hephaestus is making tripods that of their own motion could enter a divine gathering and then return home. The ancient Greek word that I have translated as of their own motion is automatoi, where we get our word automatic. Importantly, this is not how Hephaestus himself moves. As you can see in this second passage, Hephaestus uses a thick staff, but he is also assisted by attendants that are made of gold and resembling live maidens. Unlike the tripods, Hephaestus doesn't move automatically. He moves by means of two different assistive devices. Now, Hephaestus uses assistive devices elsewhere in myth and art. On the frieze of the Parthenon in Athens on the Acropolis, the disabled god sits among the other Olympian gods. He here shares a couch with his sister Athena, and you can see that he has a staff or a crutch tucked up under his armpit. This would have been much more visible originally when it was painted. Hephaestus sometimes rides animals, like in many depictions of the mythological event referred to as the return of Hephaestus, where the god rides a donkey or a mule. So staffs and donkeys or mules assist Hephaestus in his mobility. But sometimes the god's assistive devices are more technologically complicated than these, like those golden maidens from the Iliad, or as you can see on this vase, a wheeled and winged chair. The ancient Greeks didn't have wheelchairs in the way that we think of them, and yet in a mythological context, the disabled god rides a chair with wheels, which signify movement, and wings, which signify speed. This isn't a modern wheelchair, and yet it serves the same basic function. So in the mythological realm, the ancient Greeks imagined their disabled god using a variety of assistive devices, from a simple staff to golden maidens and a winged chair. All of them function to enable their mobility in various ways. Of course, those golden maidens and the wheeled chair are works of Hephaestus, a god with divine skill. And these were probably beyond the abilities of mortal craftsmen to create. But they here signal an awareness of what we call impairment effects. Impairment effects are the direct and sometimes restricting impacts that physical impairments have on people's lived lives. Hephaestus has impairment effects like limping and labored movement, and he can mitigate them by means of a variety of assistive devices. Like Hephaestus, disabled mortals had and used a variety of assistive devices to help them mitigate their own impairment effects. For the rest of my time, I'm going to talk about assistive technology in ancient Greece. Now, that term, assistive technology, is broad, and it covers a variety of devices under its umbrella. And assistive devices can then be categorized according to the functions that they assist with. For the sake of a consistent thread, I'm going to focus on assistive devices that help with mobility. In the modern period, the first thing that people tend to think about is wheelchairs, but in fact, a wide range of things fit into this category. And not all of them are devices in the way that we're used to thinking about them. Some of the things that I'll talk about tonight might seem obvious based on our modern understandings, but it's important that we establish whether or not the ancient Greeks explicitly understood these things as being assistive in the context of disability. As an example of kind of trap that we might fall into, let's look at prostheses. In the modern period, we tend to think about prostheses as mobility devices and even as hypermobility devices if you think about the lower limb prostheses that some athletes wear. Prostheses did exist in the ancient world. Here's a famous example of an ancient prosthesis, what we call the Capua limb, which is found in a tomb in Capua, Italy. This is actually a reproduction of the original limb, which was destroyed during World War II. The object is dated to about 300 BCE by archaeologists. In its general form, this was a wooden core surrounded by bronze sheathing. The whole apparatus would have been attached to the user's body with something like leather straps and a leather belt. Prostheses of any type are rare in the ancient world. And if you're interested in these, you can check out the work of Dr. Jane Draycott. And ones like this that replaced major limbs were probably not quite functional. It would have been very heavy with the wood, bronze, and leather, and it likely would have been uncomfortable to put weight on, and that pressure would have caused sores that could have become infected. Less substantial prostheses might have been somewhat functional. The 5th century BCE historian Herodotus tells a story about this prophet named Hegesistratus from the Greek city of Elis. Hegesistratus was imprisoned by the Spartans and his feet were bound in shackles. In order to escape, he cut his own foot in half, nearly removing half of it. He was able to slip out of his bonds and make it to safety, at which point he fashioned himself a wooden prosthesis to replace the front half of his foot. We're told that he continued to practice divination until he was finally killed. It's possible that smaller prostheses like that may have been functional, but larger ones, like the capua limb, were probably more about appearance than function. Prostheses are a good example about why we can't make obvious arguments based on what we think we know about disability in the modern period. As we go through the following devices, aids, tools, I want to show you that the ancient Greeks explicitly connected them with disability and understood them as mitigating impairment effects that resulted from mobility impairments. So the most ubiquitous mobility devices in ancient Greece were staffs, crutches, and canes. I'm just going to call them staffs for the sake of brevity, but sometimes the context lends a more specific identification. These objects are a great starting point because they are familiar to us in the modern period, but also because they appear so much in ancient art and ancient literature that they barely even register to us as anything more than generic accessories or attributes. To illustrate how common these are, the Beasley Archive Pottery Database is the world's largest database of ancient Greek painted pottery. This contains records for more than 130,000 ancient pots. You can search by term words for people, animals, objects, and monuments in painted scenes. The word staff is the 9th most frequently occurring term word in this database. Staffs in ancient Greek art and literature are like eyeglasses in the modern period. They are so common that we don't even notice them when they are around us. And if we do notice them, we don't connect them with disability. But the ancient Greeks explicitly depicted and discussed staffs in the context of disability. Consider the famous riddle of the Sphinx. There was this monstrous Sphinx that terrorized the city of Thebes. It would present passersby with a riddle, and if you couldn't answer it, she would eat you. As we summarize the riddle, it goes something like this. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at midday, and 3 legs in the evening? Now, this riddle was famously solved by the hero Oedipus, whose own mobility impairment may have given him the epistemic insight to recognize that the answer was humans who crawl on all 4s as infants the morning of their lives, who walk on 2 legs in the afternoon as adults, and who use a staff as a 3rd leg in the evening of their lives in their older adulthood. The riddle essentializes that a defining feature of old age is using a staff as a 3rd leg to aid mobility. At this stage of your life, the staff is a literal part of your body. The medical treatises collected under the name of Hippocrates contain references to staffs as assistive devices. For just one example, there's a treatise called On Joints, which dates to the 5th or 4th centuries BCE. In this treatise, the physician is discussing various kinds of joint issues, including hip dislocations, like one in which the head of the femur is displaced inward in the direction of the perineum. He says that if this type of dislocation happens, you can't use that leg. The thigh shortens and the soft tissues atrophy. He said when this type of dislocation is congenital, or if it happens in early childhood, people tend to move around on their sound leg and support themselves on the ground with their hand. But he says when they experience this misfortune during early childhood and they're trained correctly, they use their sound leg to stand upright, but they carry a crutch under the armpit on the side with the sound leg and some under both arms. Now, most of the discussions in the medical texts about staffs are in the context of long-term or even permanent use. So like the riddle of the Sphinx, staffs are assistive in the context of disability, and they are features of people's everyday lives. In the 4th century BCE, the city of Athens sponsored a kind of disability pension for citizens. We know about it from a few sources, but it is most clearly outlined in a text that we call the Athenian Constitution. The law says, and the council also inspects disabled people. For there is a law that orders that the council inspect those possessing less than 3 minae and being so impaired in their bodies that they are unable to perform any work, and give each man at the public expense a maintenance of 2 obols a day. And there's a treasurer appointed by lot for them. So citizens must meet 2 criteria. They must possess less than 3 minae, which is quite a bit of money. And they must be so disabled that they are unable to work. Now, this is important generally for my work because it implies that there were plenty of disabled people who could work. But in this context, I bring it up because we know of at least one person who is accused of receiving this pension fraudulently. And his surviving defense speech tells us about 2 separate mobility devices that he used. Now, the speaker doesn't give us a lot of details, which raises some red flags in his defense. But one thing that we can be relatively sure about is that he did have a mobility impairment, because he would have delivered this speech in person among people who lived in the same city, some of whom surely knew him, and all of whom could see him as he spoke, making his bodily claims verifiably true or false. In the speech, he actually tells us that while other people use only 1 staff, he actually needs 2. And more than that, he tells us about another way that his mobility is aided. He says, the fact that I use 2 staffs while others use 1, that's a reference to his accuser, he doesn't claim that this is characteristic of non-disabled people. But the fact that I mount horses, he uses as proof to you all that I'm non-disabled. I use both of these things for the same reason. He's very clear. He uses 2 staffs and he rides horses, and he explicitly tells us that the staffs and the horses serve the same function for him. They mitigate his impairment effects stemming from his disability. Now, the historian Herodotus, whom I mentioned earlier, he tells this other story about this priestess of Hera from the city of Argos. She needed to go to the sanctuary, which is about 9 kilometers away from the city. But unfortunately, the oxen who were supposed to pull her wagon didn't arrive in time. This bovine failure requires us to understand that animals could enable mobility and serve an assistive function. Of course, animals are not devices in the sense that they're not built, but obviously the ancient Greeks understood that horses and similar animals could serve an assistive function in some contexts. That means that our first 2 assistive devices, as it were, are the same ones used by the disabled god Hephaestus in mythology. Now, fortunately for the priestess, her sons Cleobus and Phaeton harnessed themselves to the yoke, and they pulled her wagon, carrying the mother themselves, which brings us to my next sort of aid for mobility, which is humans. Now, Hephaestus created his own human-like figures to help him around his workshop. And in other mythological contexts, we see people serving an assistive function, like Antigone, who helps her elderly father, who's both blind and mobility impaired, as he's in exile from his hometown of Thebes. We have plenty of other evidence of humans playing a direct role in assisting other humans with their mobility, as well as with other needs. In the 4th century BCE, visitors to the healing sanctuary of Asclepius at Epidaurus sometimes had their experiences recorded by priests on stelae that were put on display for all to see. Now, we are not exactly sure about the purpose for these records and their inscription in the sanctuary, but in one such record, we read that a man was healed in his toe by a snake. He was terribly affected by a malignant wound in the toe. He was carried out by attendants during the day, and he was sitting on a seat. This man's mobility was apparently impaired by a lesion or an ulceration on his toe, and we can imagine that he was in quite a bit of pain and couldn't walk, and he had to be carried during the day by attendants who we should probably understand were enslaved. Another record from the same site tells us a story about a woman named Sostrata who traveled to the sanctuary at Epidaurus from Thessaly, which is quite a long way away. Sostrata was carried the entire way there and back on a litter. And at one point, she even instructed the people carrying her to set her down on the ground, demonstrating that the use of humans to aid her mobility did not limit her agency. The same idea shows up on a late 5th century BCE relief from Macedonia. Here we see a man reclining on a litter that's being carried by 4 men. 2 other men throw stones at a snake that coils around a tree in the center. The snake is what puts us in a healing context. Remember the man earlier with the ulceration on his toe that was healed by a snake. The healing god Asclepius's staff is surrounded by a snake. We can interpret the man in the center as being carried because he cannot walk, whether due to injury, illness, or disability. So far then, we have staffs, animals like horses and oxen, and humans all providing assistance, and that assistance being explicitly connected with impaired or limited mobility and therefore disability. Architectural features could likewise serve an assistive function, and in this case, I'm talking about ramps. Now, the use of ramps to aid mobility is not attested in literature, but we can reconstruct this from the archaeological remains. Some famous examples of ramps, including the long ramp that led to the top of the Athenian Acropolis, and this one on the Temple of Aphaia on the island of Aegina. Now, ramps are primarily on temple buildings, and they're usually explained in 3 ways: that they helped convey wheeled traffic, sacrificial animals, or heavy dedications. Now, ramps would, of course, have been useful for these purposes, but we can actually rule them all out as the primary impetus for the construction of ramps in sanctuary spaces. In the first place, most of the buildings that have ramps would have been packed with columns, dedications, furniture, and people. There would not have been enough room for carts and wagons, let alone sacrificial animals. And sacrifices took place on altars outside of temples, so you wouldn't risk the damage that animals could cause by bringing them up into the temple itself. And finally, ramps cannot have been necessary for moving heavy dedications, because while most or all temples would have housed very heavy dedications like those, most temples don't have ramps, and neither do treasury buildings whose only job was to store dedications like that. Now, ramps represent a big investment in terms of time and materials. They also require more space inside of a sanctuary than stairs, and that's probably why there just aren't that many of them. In one study of ramps, Dr. Katja Sporn identified 18 ramps attached to temple buildings. You can see them plotted on this map here. Now, there are hundreds and hundreds of temples in the Greek world, so 18 is just not a lot of ramps. Now, Sporn's study focused specifically on temples and primarily on the main temple within a sanctuary. And from this, we can say very clearly that most sanctuaries have no ramps at all. A small number of sanctuaries have just one ramp on their main temple. But if we broaden our terms to include not just the main temple at a sanctuary, but also smaller temples and subsidiary buildings, a new pattern emerges. Let's look at the sanctuary of Asclepius at Epidaurus, which was the most important healing sanctuary in ancient Greece. You can see it plotted on the map just down here. Now, Sporn noted that this large pan-Hellenic sanctuary had a ramp on its main temple, as well as on the so-called tholos or thymelae, which you can see at the round building in the background here. This reconstruction gives you a good sense of their appearance. What is important here is that in addition to these 2 ramps, there are actually 9 more ramps at the site, for a total of 11 permanent stone ramps on 9 separate structures. Now, not all of the buildings within the structure had ramped entrances, but the unramped buildings that people needed to access as a part of the healing ritual were at ground level, meaning that they didn't need ramps to be accessible. This combination of ramps on raised buildings and ground level construction for other buildings bears out at a second healing sanctuary of Asclepius at Corinth. This correlation between ramps and healing sanctuaries suggests that the ramps were built to serve a specific purpose that was critical to the success of these specific sanctuaries. We know that these sanctuaries were intended to serve people who sought healing, including a lot of people whose mobility was impaired through injury, illness, age, disability, or pregnancy. It included people like the man earlier with the wound on his toe who had to be carried. The ramp served to facilitate access to raised buildings at these healing sanctuaries so that visitors could enter and exit or be carried in and out of the buildings that they needed to access for the healing ritual. The ramps then functioned to aid the mobility of visitors to the healing sanctuaries. The list of mobility devices even includes things like specific kinds of shoes. The Hippocratic physician who wrote On Joints, which I mentioned earlier, also discusses people who are born with clubfoot. He describes a lengthy treatment plan for clubfoot. And then he says that when it comes to the point of needing shoes, strong boots called mud walkers are best suited for it. But this type of shoe yields least under the foot, but instead the foot yields to it. Also suitable are the Creighton type of shoes. Now, these are not specially made orthopedic shoes. These are just regular shoes that the physician identifies as being well adapted in their form to people with clubfoot. These styles of shoe enable the mobility for some disabled people in the same way that they enable the mobility for non-disabled people who choose the same style. Now, at this point, right, we have staffs. We've got animals, either alone or pulling carts, humans, architectural features, and even particular kinds of shoes, all serving to assist mobility impaired people. We focus specifically on mobility impairments, but if we expand our view, we could see other types of things serving to mitigate the effects of other types of impairments. I'll give you a few examples. We have these feeding bottles, which are heavily associated with infants and small children in ancient Greece, though in rare circumstances, they're found in association with adults, especially older adults who have things like a lot of antemortem tooth loss, so it would have made chewing very difficult. The bottles serve to assist people, mostly infants and small children, but also sometimes adults who had difficulty eating in the same way as their peers, whether that meant breastfeeding for infants or chewing solid foods for older children and adults. They can also be used to administer certain types of liquid medicines. Now, included in the types of people that we know or can suppose benefited from these cups, included infants and children who were very sick, as well as some who had oral facial injuries or conditions, including cleft palate. We have evidence that people with impaired vision or blindness could be guided by human attendants and potentially also use staffs like modern white sticks to help guide their step. Some scholars have even suggested that the so-called forum frieze from the atrium of the Praedia of Julia Felix at Pompeii shows a blind man using a dog as a guide. Sorry for the poor quality of the photo here. We have stories, mostly from the Roman period, of people being read to when they couldn't read themselves due to things like migraines or poor eyesight. Now, if we as modern students of the ancient world, if we can acknowledge that all of these things functioned as assistive devices, and if we embrace an approach to the ancient world that's informed by disability studies and critical disability theory, there are a few things that we can do. First and foremost, a theoretically informed approach acknowledges that assistive devices are enabling, not limiting. Sometimes in the modern period, we think about assistive devices as signaling a failure of the body, and we think about them in terms of dependency. You can think about the term wheelchair bound, how it implies that people are stuck in the chairs, ignoring the fact that the chair enables people to become unstuck. Many people resist using assistive devices like canes, walkers, and wheelchairs when they need them because they want to avoid the negative associations that come with their use. The stigma around assistive devices in the modern period is strong enough to disguise the fact that assistive devices enable independence and autonomy for their users. It is the devices that allow people to live more independently. So if we can acknowledge that assistive devices are enabling, we can then reframe how we approach and consequently understand disability, and with it, things like disabled embodiment in ancient Greece. Of course, not everyone would have had access to the same kinds of assistive devices. It is important to appreciate the intersecting factors of things like wealth, status, and gender. But if we can shift our focus away from people disabled by impairments to people living with impairments, we can see that people with mobility impairments could move about their communities, often independently, and they could even travel long distances. Once we accept that mobility impaired is not a synonym for immobile, we can open ourselves up to the idea that disabled people were not just present in their communities, but that they were active participants within them. With this approach, we can repopulate ancient communities with the people who actually lived in them. We can understand the examples that we have of disabled ancient Greeks, not as exceptions, but as variations on ancient life. People like Agesilaus II, a king of Sparta in the 4th century BCE, who had a congenital disability that affected his mobility. Or like this disabled man in this depiction of a pottery workshop stoking a kiln. You can see the way that his foot is depicted as modified or different. Another thing that we can do, and this is the thought I'd like to leave you with, is we can use this idea of assistive technology to consider the ways that we segregate disabled lives from other types of lives in our minds and in our work. The word technology comes from ancient Greek. It's a combination of the word techne, which is translated as something like art, skill, or craft, and logos, which is variously a word, a thought, or an idea. Simply put, technology is the practical application of knowledge, the application of knowledge to the practical aims of human life and to the change and the manipulation of the human environment. All technologies are assistive in the sense that they expand the capacity of the human body to function and to perform. Tonight, and because I work on disability, I've separated assistive technology as if it's its own type of technology. And generally, assistive technology is separated from other types of technologies. But I wonder why exactly the technologies that assist all of us in our daily lives are separated from the technologies that assist disabled people. What exactly is the difference between a non-disabled person who uses a walking stick to remain steady on a hike and a disabled person who uses a walking stick for the same purpose? Where do we draw the line between technology and assistive technology when all technologies are assistive? And who makes the decision about where that line is drawn? Thank you.
Hello, my name's Associate Professor Leslie Beaumont. I'm from the discipline of archaeology here at the University of Sydney. And on behalf of all of us, I would like to thank Debbie very much indeed for her thought-provoking lecture, very thought-provoking lecture. I think our default way of thinking about the ancient Greek world pulls us towards what is often called the classical ideal. The classical ideal of beauty and perfection of proportion, physical form. Think here, for example, of the figures on the Parthenon frieze. We saw one or two examples of them in the sides, or think of Polykleitos' Doryphorus, the sculpture that was thought by ancient people to embody, or ancient Greek people to embody, the classical ideal. But what Debbie's done for us this evening is to reveal something of the reality of life in ancient Greece. A reality that included physical disability. It was also, of course, a reality that included mental disability, but that wasn't the focus of tonight's talk. Disability in antiquity is such an important topic, and one that's still very much in its infancy, where awareness and scholarly investigation of the subject are concerned. And we thank you, Debbie, for highlighting this subject and causing us to look at the ancient Greek world through a new filter, and one that I think is going to become increasingly part of our awareness. Now, due to COVID, it took you 3 years to get to Sydney to take up the Apollo Fellowship, but it was well worth us waiting for that time. I know that you'll be leaving Sydney tomorrow, traveling first with Dr. Hugh Thomas to visit the prehistoric Alula and Khyber excavation project in Saudi Arabia. And will then be flying on to Athens, where you'll take up your post as excavation director of the Athenian Agora excavations. And I know from talking to you that you're aiming to investigate and work with bringing disabled participants into the field of excavation, a field that has for far too long been considered the area where only able-bodied people can participate. Kalotaksi Debbie, Kaliahi, and at least I look forward to catching up with you in person in Athens next month. And so that we have the opportunity to speak with Debbie and talk with her about her paper and ask her questions and discuss it with her, I'd like to invite all of you to come down to the next level of the museum, to the Sounds Cafe, which is still open, to enjoy a glass of wine or your chosen beverage and indeed speak with Debbie. So thank you.